Egypt is because, and a lot of people might not know this, is the vast majority of our earliest Christian manuscripts come from Egypt.
So Wes Huff in Apologia Center explains why Egypt is so important for the amazing evidence for God. So let's get right into it.
You said that you and a colleague went to Egypt. Now, the gut reaction here is, well, why Egypt? Like, why not, say, modern day Turkey? So like Asia Minor area. Why not Israel? This is
Yep.
typically the area in which these documents are being written in. I mean, why not Greece? Like why not go to Athens and Corinth and stuff like that? And you're ending up in Egypt. So tell us why Egypt is very important. It might be just like your favorite place on the planet, but why in regards to documentation, are you going to Egypt?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And that's a question we tackle right at the beginning of our video series, because I think people would automatically assume, well, why didn't you go to Israel? At that time, in the summer, we would have actually been able to go to Israel. But the reason we went to Egypt is because, and a lot of people might not know this, is the vast majority of our earliest Christian manuscripts come from Egypt. And there are some very specific reasons for that. One has to do with the fact that there was a large Christian population within Egypt. You remember Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, when his family flees, they go to Egypt. And that's because there was a Jewish population within a large portion of Egypt, spread out through all of Egypt, both in Upper and Lower Egypt. And later on, a very influential Christian population throughout Egypt. But also, the writing material at the time was papyrus, which is made from the papyrus plant, which grows almost exclusively on the banks of the River Nile. And so the production hub of the ancient world of writing material, of the actual physical document, was Egypt. I mean, you also had parchment and vellum, which was animal skin, but that didn't really become popular until a little bit later on. And it was largely more expensive to produce because you had to kill the animal. But papyrus was largely available, and it was grew quite readily along the banks of the Nile River. And not just that, but you had large educational centers throughout Egypt in places like Alexandria and Oxyrhynchus and Elephantine. There were not just places that were producing.
Yeah, that's what he was saying. Animal skins came more later on. Obviously, animal skins were more expensive, like what he's just saying. He said in another video that it would take around over 350 sheep in order for them to write the entire Bible. That's a lot of sheep.
The writing material, but we're actually teaching, and we're doing things like translation work. A good portion of the Greek translation of the Old Testament that the New Testament authors use a good amount of the time comes from the project that was done probably in Alexandria in Egypt when at least the first 5 books of the Bible were produced there, the Torah, about 200 years before Jesus. But another big reason, this is probably the major reason for why we have so many Christian and Jewish manuscripts from Egypt, is because of the climate, because it's so dry. And the same reason you have just a constant flow of Egyptian antiquities and mummies being pulled from the desert is not because they were producing more dead people or producing more valuables that were being buried. It's because the climate is so dry that it just preserves everything.
That's why, like the Sinai Bible or Sinaiticus, I believe that was found in Egypt because it preserves a lot longer. That is very interesting.
The pharaohs were so well preserved in the desert is the same reason why manuscripts are so well preserved in the desert. And it largely has to do with the arid climate. So it's not that there are more copies coming from Egypt, although I think that is the case. I think there were just copies that were preserved for a longer amount of time due to the weather than other places around the Mediterranean, due to the fact that, I mean, I live here in Canada. You wouldn't be able to you can't preserve books. If I bury a book, it's done within like 15 years. Like no one's digging it up 2,000 years later. But we can do that with a lot of documents in Egypt, because
you mentioned a couple of things in regards to Alexandria. I mean, for those who are familiar with history, you think about the library, the Great Library of Alexandria, and just the philosophical thoughts coming out of that part of the world. Would you also say it's because kind of they might have a culture of literature and they valued these things within just general Egyptian society, and then when people became Christians, and we have some awesome bishops that come out of that section of the world in regards to the early church, that kind of helped produce copies and writings. I mean, it's a theological hub, right? Like if you study early church history, you're looking at influences from Egypt or Antioch. I mean, you got the Alexandrian school, the Antiochian school. You have,
Right.
you have Philo of Alexandria. That's that lots of New Testament scholars will kind of reference and say, well, here's what he's doing. Is that what New Testament folks are doing? I mean, it seems to be a hub, just generally speaking.
I think there is an aspect of that. We do have to be careful in the sense of literacy in the ancient world was still very low. I mean, Jesus's day, it probably was across the Roman Empire, probably didn't reach more than 5%. And in Roman occupied Galilee and Judea, it probably didn't go higher than 3%. Although
Wow.
that number is a little bit more tricky than just giving that flat statistic. Although literacy was very low, I think maybe a bigger factor is the fact that Christians were unique in the sense that they were tied to written documents. And this is by nature of their Jewish heritage, right? The Jews had this very central idea that God made covenants with humanity, and those covenants were followed up by written documentation. And when Jesus comes and establishes the new covenant, I think it would have been very organic for the earliest Christians who were Jewish believers in Jesus as the Messiah to say, okay, we had the Torah because God made a covenant with Moses. We had the prophets because God was making promises to his people and giving commands to his people. And we had, all these things where you had God giving commands, giving promises, giving precepts, and is followed up by literal writing, either inscribed on tablets or written on scrolls. Well, then Jesus comes and he establishes the new covenant. I think they would have naturally said, okay, well, where are the books? Where's the written documentation that go along with the covenants? And so because Christians and Jews were so tied to literature, they are unique in the ancient world religious systems, which had religious texts, but were not nearly as central to the belief system and faith as you see Jews and Christians with the Jews with the Tanakh, what we call the Old Testament, and Christians with the New Testament and the Old Testament. And so I think that plays a big part in it, is that Christians could have very well have been seen as a literary community as they could have been seen as a religious community, because wherever they went, they were copying and they were producing and they were disseminating these books, even at times when they may not have actually known how to read them. And we can pinpoint this, we can figure this out within people who write things who don't know how to read the language make mistakes that people who know how to read the language don't. And so, but they were so eager to get the gospel message out that they didn't ask for your scribal qualifications. If you wanted a copy and you didn't have a copy within your church community of, say, one of the letters of Paul, they were going to do everything they possibly could to pay someone who's like a professional scribe to write it or try to attempt it themselves. And this was a big factor in the gospel spreading throughout the ancient world. I mean, it also came with the textual mistakes, because when you have a lot of people who are copying a lot of handwritten things, and sometimes they don't even know what they're writing. Well, they know what they're writing, but they don't know they can't read it necessarily. Then they make mistakes.
Wow.
And so one of the downsides is that you have these textual differences within the manuscript tradition. But the upside is that the gospel gets spread really far, really quickly.
So we know that the Bible is reliable and we can trust in it. We don't have to be worried or afraid.